So, can I, on behalf of the members of the committee, welcome Charles Counsell, who's the Chief Executive of the Pensions Regulator, David Fairs, who's the Executive Director of Regulatory Policy Analysis and Advice at the Pensions Regulator, and Liz Hickey, who's the Director of Communications, also at the Pensions Regulator. Maybe I should ask each of you in turn just to say hello so we can make sure that everyone has seen each of our witnesses. So, Charles, do you want to say hello first?
Yes, good morning. Charles Counsell, Chief Executive of the Pensions Regulator.
Thank you.
Hello.
David?
Hello, David Fairs, Executive Director of Regulatory Policy Analysis and Advice.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Liz Hickey. I'm the Director of Communications at the Pensions Regulator.
Well, thank you all very much for being willing to join us today. We're grateful to all of you for taking part in this session. As you know, we've got a number of questions we want to raise with you, and I'm going to start, if I may, with some questions about what's happening on auto-enrolment during this crisis. The Pensions Regulator, I know, has said that you will take, and I quote, a proportionate and risk-based approach towards enforcement decisions with the aim of supporting both employers and savers. Can you explain to us what exactly you mean by that? What are you going to be doing?
Yes, let me do that, Mr. Timms. Thank you for inviting us this morning to this committee. And may I just say a word or two about our overall approach to what has been a huge challenge.
Charles, can I interrupt? Yeah. We're losing you. I didn't hear that last sentence or so.
I was starting by saying.
He's gone again.
You hear me?
No.
That's where he's sitting.
Is it possible to, I wonder if it's worth trying to be nearer the mic or something like that?
Can you hear me now?
That seems better.
Let me try again in that case. Sorry about that. Hopefully you can hear me. Our commitment throughout this has been to protect pension savers, and as always to put savers at the heart. So everything that we have done through this COVID-19 period has been with that focus, to be clear and to be quick in issuing guidance to trustees, administrators, so that we are pragmatic and also warning out savers so that we prevent savers any rush and raise the awareness of hazards. Internally, our focus has been the safety and well-being of our staff, so that we continue to job protecting savers. In terms of the proportionate and risk-based approach to automatic enrolment, of course, automatic enrolment duties do continue to apply, and some employers may, of course, struggle to meet their duties. And we're working with employers to contact support where necessary time to comply. The government, through the job protection scheme, has also provided support to employers so that staff that are furloughed, payments, some of the furlough payments are used for employer contributions. We will continue to monitor employer contributions and contribution failures this period. What we have said to scheme providers is that we normally expect them to report contribution failures after 90 days. We've extended that period to 50 days to give employers a bit more time.
Sorry, Charles, I lost a little bit of that. Could you just tell me those periods again, the usual period and the one you're applying at the moment?
The usual period is 90 days. And what we said to providers is that we give them 150 days.
150
days. And we've also suspended temporarily our bulk enforcement activity in this area, again to reduce the burden on employers. Finally, we've asked scheme providers to be flexible in collecting contributions, and we encourage employers to go to their scheme provider to them about how they may schedule contributions over a longer period of time. If like, there's an analogy with what the PRA and FCA have done with mortgage holidays in providing more time for employers.
Can I ask, are you seeing, in fact, much falling away of auto-enrolment contributions at the moment?
I mean, it's quite early days, but we haven't seen that yet. And through our data, we've not seen a great change, and indeed, more broadly, we're also seeing people being automatically enrolled when the duties apply to them. And we can see that directly in our data. With the DWP, we are currently carrying out a survey of providers to find out more about what has actually been happening in terms of opt-outs and in terms of contributions.
You mentioned that the normal period you allow is 90 days. If contributions are delayed beyond 90 days in the normal course of events, what enforcement powers do you deploy?
In the first instance, we issue what is called an unpaid contribution notice, which gives the employer a period of time to make the payments that has not been made. And again, we encourage them to contact their pension scheme. If they fail to make those payments after they receive the unpaid contribution notice, we may then issue a fixed penalty notice, and indeed we may then take further action if they continue not to pay.
And can you give us an indication of how frequently you use those notices in the normal course of events? How many did you issue last year, for example, or something like that?
I'm afraid off the top of my head, I don't have that number, but I can certainly come back to the committee and provide that. I mean, typically, the vast majority of employers do pay their contributions and do pay them on time.
Yeah. Now, you said that you're not going to be using those enforcement instruments at all in the crisis. That's correct, is it? So if contributions are delayed beyond now 150 days, what will you do?
Well, I think there's two things to say here. First of all, we wouldn't typically use our powers around unpaid contributions. However, if an employer is deducting an employee contribution, not paying that over to the scheme, then we would take that seriously. So, we would find that out through, for instance, whistleblowing reports from employees themselves. So it's not to say that we would never use our powers at the moment. Where we see really serious failures, we absolutely will do. And the second thing to say is that we do expect contributions to be made in the end. And so these are temporary easements, they're not permanent easements, and those contributions should be made. Again, I use the analogy of mortgage holidays. Contributions, the mortgage payments need to be made at the end, as will automatic enrolment contributions.
Yeah. And have you indicated what sort of time scale they would have to be eventually paid in?
What we'd encourage employers to do is to talk to their pension scheme and come up with a payment plan that works for that employer, depending on their financial circumstances. Okay.
And a last question from me. Have you been approached by employers who've got a bit of financial difficulty at the moment, saying to you, we're really struggling with this, can you go easy on us or whatever? Have there been such approaches from employers during this crisis?
We've had very, very few approaches from employers. And again, in the first instance, we would expect employers to speak to the scheme provider.
Right. And generally, you are not seeing any signs of problems with auto-enrolment contributions being made at present?
No, generally not. I mean, clearly we need to keep an eye on this over the next few months. and clearly how this crisis unfolds in the next few months may determine what happens. At the moment, that's true. And equally, while one large scheme provider has said they're seeing a small uptick in cessations, at the moment we're not seeing a big increase there, though we will again keep an eye on it.
Sorry, I lost a little bit of your last couple of sentences. You were referring to one provider, I think.
One scheme provider has seen a small uptick in opt-outs or cessations, and we're going to across all scheme providers, major scheme providers, to get a clearer picture of that. But we haven't seen a major uptick.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Dr. Ben Spencer, so the next question.
Thank you. So you mentioned that the coronavirus job retention scheme, the furloughing, has some provision in terms of contributions, but do you think that the government should have be proposing other short-term support to help employers meet their contributions during this time?
To help employers meet their contributions. I mean, the job retention scheme very significantly does that, of course, for staff who have been furloughed. So the job retention scheme allows for the minimum employer contributions to be paid on behalf of the pension saver to the scheme. This is
Charles, we're losing you again.
I'm sorry. Is that any better?
Yes.
I was saying that the job retention scheme does go a long way to help employers for those staff who have been furloughed. The furlough arrangements allow for the minimum contributions to be paid on behalf of the pension saver into the pension scheme. Of course, it is the minimum contributions, and so for those employers who may pay above contributions, we have said in our guidance that for those employees who have been furloughed, only for those who have been furloughed, the employer may reduce their contributions to the minimum without cessation at the moment.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. I'm really struggling here. Do you want to try taking off your video stream and see if that works better? It's just this is a critical point. I just want to just try and understand it clearly.
That's me without the video. Is that any better in terms of hearing?
That's much better.
Oh, great. Did you catch the answer I just gave? Shall I repeat it?
Unfortunately, it's gone bad again. The wonders of working from home. Could you share what do you suggest?
Charles, you haven't by any chance got any headphones, have you?
I'm afraid. What I could do, though, which is not ideal, but I could dial in.
That probably is worth a try. Yeah.
Maybe if I could just pick up what I think Charles was trying to say, which is that the furlough scheme does reimburse the employer minimum contributions under automatic enrolment. So to some degree goes towards meeting that burden on employers. For employers who pay more than automatic enrolment minimum, they are permitted to reduce their contributions to the level that is just reimbursed under the job retention scheme.
Thank you. How about for the employers who want furloughing? I mean, this is something that some of my constituents have contacted me about. That clearly there's a lot of people who are furloughed, but there's also a lot of businesses which are running exceptionally lean and not furloughing staff, and they're in, telling me that they're in trouble, and contributions is a part where they feel there could be room to manoeuvre. What's your reflections on that?
So I think there is a balance to be struck here, because contributions which are paid at times like this may turn out to be particularly valuable contributions if markets turn back to normality. So what we're having to do is balance the interests of those members to make sure that contributions are paid in on their behalf, as I say, at what might be a particularly auspicious time, versus the burden that is on employers. We did take the decision that we would allow contributions to be reduced for furloughed employees, but for other employers who are paying higher levels of contributions, for non-furloughed employees, we would require them to go through the normal statutory 60-day notice period to reduce contributions, or if they're in defined benefit schemes, to change accrual. That is something that we're monitoring, and we'll change if we think it's appropriate to do so.
I have rejoined by telephone.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to my next question. So we've heard that many people are having difficulties covering their basic costs because of coronavirus. And could the government support people by, for example, letting employees take a break from auto enrolment, so allowing them to opt into a short-term suspension of contributions?
Let me pick that up.
The
legislation already allows.
Charles, we've now got a serious echo on the line. I wonder, are you still on the Teams video as well?
I was. I'm not anymore.
That sounds better.
Is that better? No,
yeah,
great.
Great.
The legislation already, many apologies for that. The legislation already allows for employees to opt out, and we've got to recognise that over this period, household finances will be under in real difficulties. So an employee can opt out for a period of time, and then when it is right for them, they can opt back in to the scheme, and the employer should allow them to come back into the scheme. And of course, if they don't opt back in, the triennial re-enrolment, at the triennial re-enrolment point, an employee will be put back into the scheme in any case.
And one of the who you think best should be communicating this to employees in terms of their options?
Well, the guidance that we've got on our website does set all of that out. I mean, what an employer cannot do and should not do is encourage their employees to opt out. It must be the employee's choice.
And I wonder, just building on that, so I wonder if do you think there's an issue here? Because let's say that you've got an employer who is in trouble, and they're looking at balancing the books, and one area where they may be able to keep their business going would be for their staff and for them to be not paying contributions for a period of time, but they're restricted from having those discussions with their employees because of the current legal position. What do you think about that?
Well, I think again, I would encourage every employer to talk to their scheme provider. I mean, what we're really talking about, if the employer is in difficulty, is the employer contributions, not the employee contributions. And so I would encourage the employer to talk to the scheme provider and seek a payment plan that will allow them to get through this very difficult period.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And Nigel Mills.
Thank you. Could we just turn to defined benefit schemes? Have you made an assessment of what the impact of this crisis and the economic shock might have on defined benefit schemes as well?
Let me kick off, and then I'll pass over to David, if I may. I mean, the immediate crisis has absolutely seen deficits overall widen. For instance, the PPF estimate that total deficits at the end of December 2019 were £35 billion. At the end of March, that had widened to £136 billion. In truth, the deficits haven't widened as much as they might have done, and that's because a lot of schemes have put in place hedging arrangements, frankly, since the financial crisis. David, do you want to talk a little bit more detail?
Yeah, Charles, you talked there about the pension protection fund liabilities. In terms of technical provisions, as you know, schemes are required to conduct actuarial valuations every 3 years. And for the 3-year period ending in January, that had actually been relatively good for pension schemes. So something like 85% of schemes would have seen an improvement in funding level. And so as at January this year, we think schemes would be 97% funded on a technical provision basis. And that accounts to a deficit of about 65 billion. Between the beginning of January and the end of March, in total, the average funding level fell by 9%, so from 97% to 88%, giving a total deficit at that time of 233 billion. Now, the experience of individual schemes is very variable. Something like 2% of schemes would actually have seen an improvement in funding level over that 3-month period. 21% would have seen a less than 5% fall in funding level. But it is true to say that 12% of schemes would have suffered a reduction in funding level of greater than 15%. So one of the challenges for us as a regulator is that some schemes are coming through this crisis in relatively good shape, and some will have seen quite significant shortfalls. And so the nature of the easements that we have provided is to say for those schemes that can continue to meet their deficits in a timely way, they should do so. But for those schemes that are in significant financial trouble, that may have seen a significant increase in their deficits, then we put measures in place to help those companies and those schemes.
Thank you. Are you expecting this to be a short-term impact that reverses pretty quickly once hopefully life gets back to normal? Or are you planning for this to be a longer-term problem that will take some time to reverse?
I think that's quite challenging. It's difficult to know what will happen to long-term interest rates, what will happen to asset returns, but more importantly, the rate at which individual sponsoring employers are going to come out of lockdown and how quickly their business recovers. So what we have said, and we said this in our annual funding statement this year, is that schemes and employers should look at a range of scenarios, whether things return back to normal quite quickly or whether there's a prolonged impact, and set the valuation of their liabilities and put in place a recovery plan that looks at a range of scenarios so that as certainty improves, they'll have a funding plan that's appropriate for them.
And is that a plan that the Pension Protection Fund would agree with you on, or do they have any concerns about that approach?
No, they think this is the right approach. They recognise that, as I say, some employers are coming through this in relatively good shape. Some schemes are coming through this, and what we want is for those schemes to continue to their long-term target. But they recognise that for those employers that have got severe short-term financial pressures, it is appropriate that the scheme allows them to suspend or defer contributions for a limited period of time, because ultimately having a strong, profitable, sustainable employer is in the best interest of the scheme. So it's balancing that short-term financial pressure with a need for a long-term, profitable, sustainable employer.
And would you agree that those sort of discussions are best done as part of a constructive early exercise to try and make sure that the sponsor can survive, and you wouldn't encourage gun to the head discussions at the hour before liquidation, saying either we don't pay this pension contribution or we go bust? It should be a constructive relationship, or the contribution should be paid.
Absolutely. So we said in our annual funding statement this year that we do expect this year more than ever for employers and trustees to work together on setting a financial plan that works for the sponsor, but recognises the potential threat to security of members' benefits. So we set out in our guidance that employers should provide trustees with full information and the challenges that they're facing, so that trustees can make an informed decision. And we allow trustees to grant the employer a suspension or reduction of deficit contributions for a period of 3 months whilst that employer is putting the information together, but with an overriding requirement that the scheme is treated equitably compared to other stakeholders and other lenders.
So does this mean your relatively new mantra of clearer, quicker, tougher now needs to be clearer, slightly more flexible, and a little bit weaker? Or is life not quite that easy?
No, I would argue that we are still being clearer, quicker and tougher. We were quick to respond to the challenging market conditions. We recognise that the best interest, long-term best interest of a pension scheme is to have a profitable and sustainable employer. So to the extent that the pension scheme can help the employer through this short-term difficulty, then we think it's right to do so.
And are you confident that the Pension Protection Fund has enough reserves, enough money to stand behind all this if we were to see a real horrible economic scenario in the next months or coming years?
It's probably not for me to speak on behalf of the Pension Protection Fund, but the Pension Protection Fund is very conservatively funded. It is looking at scenarios and is confident that it can meet claims going forwards.
And as a final question, you were going to have a consultation on DB funding where you launched it earlier this year. Are you continuing with that, or might that have to get delayed until we're through all this crisis?
No, the funding consultation that we have is about schemes setting a long-term funding target and a journey plan on how to get there and how to deal with bumps in the road on that journey. So we think it's absolutely right that schemes do have a long-term objective. They do have a journey plan on how they get there. It's quite interesting that those schemes that already have those things in place are coming through this crisis in significantly better shape than those that don't. And this first consultation is very much around principles, around what is a sustainable investment risk, horizon of covenant, strength of covenant. And actually those things are absolutely pertinent given the situation that we're in. So we very much think that this consultation, it's right to continue and that the principles behind it are the right ones. We very clearly, when we get to the second consultation, where we look at some of the particular terms that we might set, for example, within the fast track regime that we're setting up, that we take account of the economic position that we're in at that time. So we do recognise that we'll have to adapt some of the detail reflecting the particular situation that we're now in. But overall, we think the objective of this funding consultation are right and still very much pertinent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Steve McCabe.
Hello. I'd like to ask a couple of questions about deficit reduction contributions for defined benefit schemes. As I understand it, you've issued some fairly clear advice on this. Can I ask how many schemes have currently applied for a reduction in their contributions?
So they may have a reduction in contributions through one of two approaches. They can keep the current recovery plan that they have in place, but trustees could agree to suspend or defer contributions in the short term, with those contributions being made good, but within the integrity of the recovery plan being in place. For those employers that are going down that route, they don't have to notify us that is what they're doing. The second route is that the recovery plan could be renegotiated, and typically that might mean having a longer recovery period. And we've had 60 notifications of employers that have gone down that second route. The information that we have... Can
I just check? You broadly recommend this should be for 3 months, is that right?
So we say that trustees can allow for a suspension or deferral of contribution for 3 months. We do allow trustees to agree to a longer period than 3 months, but there are some conditions that are attached to that. Principally that banks and other lenders are equally supporting the sponsoring employer. So we don't expect the pension scheme to take the entirety of that burden. But when all banks, lenders are working together, then we do permit a period longer than 3 months.
Thank you. So there are 60 schemes that you know about who are deferring in some way or other, but there could be a whole lot of other schemes that you wouldn't have any knowledge of. Is that right?
So we are talking constantly to professional trustees, to advisors, to employer covenant advisors. And that intelligence says to us that around 5 to 10% of trustees have received an application from an employer to reduce or suspend contributions. Now, as lockdown continues, we do expect that percentage to increase, but it is currently at 5 to 10%. There's some intelligence emerging that it may just have crept over 10% and be heading towards 10 to 15%.
Thank you. And if I understand correctly, one of the clear bits of advice that you've given to trustees is that where they're seeking this change in their circumstances, the employers shouldn't be paying share dividends or large bonuses to senior staff, and in fact that should be subject to a legally binding agreement. Is that right?
That is right, yes. So we wouldn't expect dividends to continue if deficit contributions are being deferred or suspended.
Right. So if the employer is seeking that change, that deferral, they shouldn't be making those payments. Do you know how many of the people who are applying are complying with a legally binding agreement to that effect?
So my understanding is that legally binding agreements are being put in place. They do seem to vary in form. Some are relatively short and straightforward. Some are quite long technical documents of potentially 50 pages or greater. But individual schemes and employers are taking advice on that, on their own particular situation, and putting in place appropriate legal documentation.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I'm really asking you is, do you have confidence that these agreements are in place and that they are legally binding?
Yeah, I think our guidance is very clear, and all the indications from talking to lawyers, advisors are that they are being put in place.
Now, the only thing that troubled me when I read about this was that I did notice that there is a caveat that says there can be exceptional circumstances where you can continue to pay bonuses and share dividends in that. And I just wondered if you could explain to me the kind of exceptional circumstances that would wipe out these protections you've put in place.
So not so much in terms of dividends, but where there are agreements to gather excess cash and put that into cash pools, then we're saying generally we would see that as weakening the covenant, and we wouldn't anticipate that that is the case. But it could be that actually there is some sort of overall group guarantee back to the particular sponsoring employer, which might give the trustees confidence that actually if they did then need that additional cash, it would be made available to them. So there is those kind of quite exceptional circumstances where we think it might be appropriate, where there is, for example, guarantees or broader support from a larger organisation.
Is there going to be some way of monitoring that to make sure it doesn't become the opportunity to drive a coach and horses through the protection you're trying to put in place?
I mean, one thing we are very acutely aware of is when easements were put in place after 2008, there were some employers, a very small number of employers, who took advantage of the easements were there when perhaps they didn't need to do that. So we very much learn from that in terms of preparing the advice. We think our guidance is very clear, and it's designed to provide those employers that need short-term help to have that short-term assistance, but not to put in place easements which can be abused by those looking to take advantage. So our intelligence is that where trustees are seeing those sorts of circumstances where employers are asking for a deferral or a suspension of contributions where it may not be actually necessary, trustees are rejecting those requests.
Can I ask one last question on that, Chair? I just wondered if you do find evidence of abuse or attempted abuse of those arrangements, what will you do about it?
Then the usual powers that we would put in place, such as the Financial Support Directive, would come into play.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, very much. Sir Desmond Swain. Desmond, we think you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Comrade, I want to come back to the code of practice consultation on funding for defined benefit schemes. Our former colleague and the former pensions minister, Professor Steve Webb, was quoted in the Financial Times saying that that this was a document written for a different era. It isn't just a 3 months blip and everything goes back to normal. We're in a different world. Does it make sense for the world that we're now moving into?
So, as I said before, I think it is really important that pension schemes have a long-term objective and they have a very clear plan on how they're going to fund member benefits. So I think those principles still apply. As I say, those schemes that already had long-term objectives in place and a journey plan on how to get there are the schemes that are absolutely coming through this crisis in better shape than those that don't. So I think that as an overarching principle is right.
I think the point that he's making is that they need a recovery plan that's going to be a lot shorter.
Well, I think we have to recognise the economic situation that we're in, and actually some of the elements of the consultation talking about sustainable investment risk. So pension schemes should not be taking investment risk, which if it doesn't play out in the way that they see, they're unable to increase contributions to then meet the higher levels of deficit. Exactly at the moment, we are seeing some schemes, a small number of schemes, that perhaps have taken a higher level of equity investment in order to help fund the pension scheme rather than put contributions in. It is exactly those schemes that may have seen the highest level of falls in deficit. So the principles and the detail that are set out in that consultation, actually with one might say with great foresight, are exactly the concerns and issues that need to be thought about when we're in a situation like we're in now.
So 12%, I think, of direct benefit, defined benefit schemes were open to new members at the end of 2019, I think. Isn't the reality that this is the last nail in the coffin of defined benefit schemes in the private sector?
I think the reality is that, as I say, defined benefit schemes are coming through this crisis with very different experience. 2% of schemes have actually seen an increase in their funding level. 21% have seen a drop in funding level of less than 5%. So I think where schemes have taken to heart the guidance that we have put out around integrated risk management, they are coming through this crisis in reasonably good shape. So they are able to sustain economic shocks like the one that we're seeing at the moment. And so where you have large employers who think it's the right type of pension provision for their employees and are continuing to offer it, as long as they have got in place appropriate integrated risk management, then they will come through this. So I think we will continue to see a number of employers continue to provide defined benefit schemes for their staff where they think it's the most appropriate type of pension arrangement for their particular employees. So we may see some reduction, that's true, but I think for some employers they will continue and will not have been significantly impacted in the scheme by the current crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Selene Saxby.
Hello. My question's around communicating with scheme members, and wondered how should trustees be communicating with members, particularly in defined contribution schemes, who are looking to access their pension savings to help with a short-term fall in income?
So I can take that one if that's helpful. So on defined contribution schemes in particular, we are asking trustees to highlight to members what the current economic volatility might mean, particularly to those that are close to retirement, and to think really carefully before switching funds. And what we're also incredibly mindful of is the potential for scam activity. So we know that scammers prey on uncertainty and stress, and that members may be vulnerable to that. There are some 5 million people who fit into the target age bracket of 45 to 65. And so we are focusing very much with our partners on raising the risk of scams at this time. So we have a partnership working group set up with the FCA, PPS, Money and Pension Service, and we've been working together for a long time to share intelligence and also to coordinate our activity. So something that we've done together is issue a joint statement warning people of the risk of scams at this time, and also worked with trustees of all schemes so that whenever a member requests a transfer out of a defined benefit contribution scheme, they will now get a letter jointly signed by all of us asking them to stop and think. Because a worrying stat that we have, in 4 people would actually make a decision to transfer out of their pension in less than 24 hours. And we really want people to take their time, seek advice, and not do that now.
Thank you. And just sort of building on that point, what is sort of the pension regulator's role in protecting savers from making those short-term decisions with longer-term negative impacts?
Yes, so we set up sort of early on a COVID-19 hub on our website, and we've been posting all of our guidance there. And we've been trying to make sure that it gets out to as many people as possible. So we've done around 12 webinars, which has reached 5,000 people, and there have been 190,000 views of that guidance, which is great. And as part of that, as I said, trustees are absolutely crucial in communicating and providing reassurance to members, particularly when it comes to scams. But more broadly, we chair a cross-organisational group called Bloom, which brings together like the Serious Fraud Office, the National Economic Crime Centre, DWP, the Treasury, looking at scams in particular. And we are sharing intelligence across that group and thinking of how we work together to get that message out really strongly. And one of the things we had success with in the last couple of years is a multi-million-pound campaign with the FCA to highlight Scam Smart and to drive people to the website to seek financial advice. And that drove 28% increase in people going to the Scam Smart website before they took decisions about their pension. And now more than ever, it is really important. So we're doing what we can to really get the message out to people. Now is not the time to make rushed decisions about your pension savings.
Thank you.
Thank you. Selene, I think you've got another question in a moment. But first of all, we've got a question from Sean Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to drill down a bit more into the scams element of this. So I've been reading recently that there's a possibility that pension scams or the rates with pension scams increased. I mean, some reports have suggested by almost 400% since the start of this crisis. I just wanted to see, from your perspective, whether you've noticed a significant increase since the COVID crisis began, and sort of how those pension scams are manifesting themselves, if you've got any sort of data around that at all.
Yes, so I think the figure of 400% was related to COVID-related fraud, which spanned a broader spectrum than just pensions. We've not got concrete evidence across our partners yet that demonstrates a significant increase in scams. But one thing that we know for absolute certainty is that this is exactly the kind of environment which unscrupulous people would seek to take advantage of. And that's why we're trying to get ahead of it by issuing the warning, by getting the letters out to everybody thinking about making a decision about their pension, stressing the importance of taking advice before you do it. And we're monitoring on an ongoing basis. So as well as Bloom that I mentioned earlier, the Department for Work and Pensions is leading a cross-government group which is gathering intelligence across the market so that we can see if there are any worrying spikes in activity and we can act quickly together.
Yeah, that's great. I also just wanted to touch a bit more as well on the sort of the wider culture around what maybe triggers pension scams. And Sir Desmond made a really good point before about sort of the changing world that we're heading into. And I was reading a report recently that suggested around 21% of 18 to 34-year-olds would consider withdrawing from their pension. Now, I know they can't do that, but what it seemed to suggest is there is this culture perhaps of thinking, well, I might take that risk at some point. So I'm just wondering what communication pieces are going out around sort of not just sort of scam related, but more widely around sort of the risk element of it, why that might not be a good idea, where, you know, and sort of the considerations that trusted individuals have to have when making those decisions.
Absolutely. So we tend to communicate with savers through trustees, but also through our partnerships with more kind of consumer-facing organisations like the Money and Pension Service and like the Financial Conduct Authority. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there is often a worry during uncertain times that people take short-term rather than long-term decisions. And obviously, a pension is a long-term investment. And we see our role in trying to help us all recover and rebuild after this crisis as maintaining some good financial resilience there for people, you know, making sure that everybody who has been saving throughout their working lives has something to fall back on. And that is what is driving us at the moment, to make sure that those people do have some retirement income, that they can see the value of saving even when it's hard, even if it's just a small amount. And so that's something that we're working with our partners across the Money and Pension Service, Department for Work and Pensions, to make sure that those messages are joined up and clear for people.
No, that's great. And just finally, I just wanted to sort of ask very quickly as well, that as this crisis sort of proceeds and more towards, we don't know when, but obviously as this crisis sort of starts to come to an end, do you think perhaps there's a risk of another spike or potential increase in the number of pension scams going forward towards the tail end of the crisis, as people still feel slightly unsure? Do you think it's going to be sort of a steady stream?
I think that's a really good point. And I think we would probably look back to the intelligence and information we had from the financial crisis. And as my colleague David said earlier, you know, we have learned an awful lot from people's behaviour during that crisis, the way that schemes reacted and behaved. Because we do have those really established sources of intelligence sharing now across our partners, we know we will get good kind of real-time information about what is happening, and we have established sort of rapid response and action plans so that we can swing into action together and respond together, which is so important because we all have different bits of the pension landscape that we look after, and actually when we're most effective is when we're bringing all of that together and responding together, however long that takes, because, you know, as you rightly point out, when the urgency is there, people are more aware. If this goes on for a long period of time and actually people's stress and anxiety is present, but they're not hearing so much about it, then that is a potential danger zone when we would want to make sure that we were reacting quickly.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Just before we go on, can I ask you, you made the point that in a period like the current period, one might expect there would be more scams or attempts at scams, perhaps more vulnerabilities to scams. What is it about the current circumstances that create that risk? What are the features currently which make scams perhaps more likely, more common than they would otherwise be?
So something that we've experienced before through the kind of intel sharing across our partners, for example, has been if a scheme features heavily in the media, or if an employer is featuring as potentially being under stress or in trouble, then we can see an increase in the numbers of people who want to transfer out of that defined benefit scheme because they start to become concerned and worried. And so something that we've been doing for the previous sort of 18 months anyway is issuing this stop and think letter from our partners to anybody. If a scheme reached those triggers, then we would immediately start working with the trustees and say, if people are requesting transfers, please send them this stop and think letter. Because for some people, transferring out might be the right decision, but for lots of people, it won't be. And so I suppose what we're seeing at the moment is a much more general sense of uncertainty and concern about everybody's business and employer. And so our concern would be it's likely to drive those rushed decisions. People worried about household finances, people worried about potentially losing their savings, and the increased focus might mean that people take decisions under stress that they wouldn't normally do if they had time and calm to consider and take advice.
Thank you. And Selene Saxby.
And how are you working with the FCA and Money and Pension Service to give a consistent message to savers? And how are you working with trustees and pension providers to get this message to the savers?
Yes, so we have had, in the kind of aftermath of the British Steel pension scheme, this committee conducted a really helpful review and inquiry that made some recommendations to us and our partners to put it bluntly, to work better together across the piece so that we were a lot more joined up. And we have acted on that, and we have our sort of core groups of senior people that at the moment are meeting on a regular basis, as well as the cross-government activity. So what we do as a result of that is we can make decisions and we can act quickly. So the transfer letter is one good example. The joint statement we issued is another example. We have further scams activity with trustees in particular, where we're speaking to trustees about different kinds of scam-aware hallmarks that they can put onto their literature, so that when they're speaking to savers, they have clarity there. And we're also planning some further advertising activity with the FCA and the Money and Pension Service. We work really closely with as well. And then in terms of trustees, what we've been doing is we've been issuing nudge emails to a variety of schemes, depending on their own circumstances. We've had 25 of those. We've had a number of newsletters, and they go out to some 30,000 contacts. And we know people are downloading the guidance. We've had 190,000 downloads of the guidance, and seeking every opportunity to drive media coverage, speak to journalists, to get the message out to people as clearly and quickly as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you, Selene. That concludes the questions that we prepared beforehand to put to you. Thank you very much for answering them all so clearly. Let me just check if there's anyone on the call who wants to put any other question that we haven't already covered. Does anyone want to chip in further? No, in that case, Charles, I take it that you're still there on the phone. I wonder if there's anything you'd like to, thank you. If there's anything that you'd like to say to us that we haven't already touched on, just to conclude our evidence session today. Charles.
Well, thank you. I mean, clearly, as this crisis continues to unfold, our focus must remain on being alert to the risk that it's presenting. And as I said at the beginning, I'm not sure, unfortunately, it was so easy to hear me. What we will do, what we have done, is keep the savers, the pension savers, right at the heart of any response and the continued response as we go forward. So hopefully you've seen that through the answers to the questions today, and we'll continue to maintain that approach.
Smashing, thank you. And that was loud and clear. Can I thank you and David and Liz? Thank you all very much for joining us today. There may well be other things that we'd like to ask you about over the next few weeks, depending on what happens, in which case we'll be in touch. But you've given us a very useful evidence session today to run through the major concerns that the committee has had. And thank you all very much for being with us. Order, order.